The midday sun melted the asphalt, and time in the park oozed like warm tree resin, slowly encasing the 40-year-old emptiness that was Igor, a designer. He sat on a bench, studying the patterns of cracks in the concrete, when two figures appeared before him. A young woman with a chiseled, almost lifeless predatory face, and a cameraman, seemingly fused with the one-eyed camera on his shoulder. The camera's glass eye fixed on Igor, and his world narrowed to that silent, all-seeing gaze. "Religion in the modern world program," the young woman stated, her voice as smooth as a river stone. "We're live. May I ask you a few questions?" Igor felt a tight knot of vanity and panic constrict within him. To refuse would be to expose his awkwardness to the world. He nodded, trying to adopt the air of a bored intellectual. The conversation began with platitudes, with polite jabs at faith, to which Igor responded with the rehearsed formulas of an enlightened man. He didn't believe. He was beyond that. He built worlds from lines and colors, not from vague dogmas. "So, you don't believe in a higher power?" the correspondent concluded, tilting her head slightly. Her eyes didn't blink. "What about a lower power, its shadow, its eternal opponent?" "The devil," Igor scoffed, feeling his confidence return. "That's just the flip side of the same fairy tale, a mechanism for intimidation." "Prove it," she said quietly. The air froze. The cameraman stepped closer, and a bewildered Igor was reflected in the lens. "Prove what?" "Your disbelief. It must be harder than stone if it's true. Sign a contract." She pulled a scroll of parchment from her folder, thick and dry like old leather. "Sell us something that doesn't exist for you, your immortal soul, in exchange for, say, $10,000. Igor froze. This was a prank. Sophisticated, cruel, but still a prank. The entire invisible audience of this live broadcast was watching him, and he felt their gazes, judging, expectant. To back down now would be to admit cowardice, to confess that primal fear resided deep within his rational soul, that he, a man of forms and structures, was afraid of an old fable. A cold, wicked thrill pricked him from within. He would play their game and win. "Why not?" he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Where's the money?" The young woman's lips curved only at the corners. She pulled a thick envelope from her bag and casually fanned out a stack of fresh, crisp banknotes. The scent of printer's ink hit his nostrils. The money was real. Then she produced a thin silver needle. "For authenticity, a seal is required, yours." She took his hand in her cold, firm grip. A brief prick on his fingertip. A drop welled on his skin, dark as cherry resin. Igor, feeling like an actor in an absurd play, bent over the parchment. The ornate text was in an unfamiliar language, but a blank line gaped at the bottom. He pressed his finger to the paper, smearing a crimson mark beneath the unfamiliar, precise handwriting. The young woman placed the envelope in his hand. "The deal is done." Without another word, she turned. She and the cameraman walked swiftly away, got into a windowless, unmarked van, and disappeared into the flow of traffic. It had all transpired in 3 minutes. Igor remained alone on the bench. The sun still beat down. Children shouted on the playground. But his world had cracked. In his hand lay a heavy envelope, stuffed with real money. And inside him, where there had once been a familiar emptiness, an icy, utterly real nothingness now expanded. The apartment door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the hum of the mundane world. Igor rushed to the table, sweeping a stack of magazines to the floor. He needed a broadcasting schedule, tangible, undeniable proof that his sanity was still holding its ground. He scanned the columns of fine print, the grid of days and hours, searching for the salvation of the title, Religion in the Modern World. It wasn't there, not on any channel, not today, not yesterday, not in the announcements for the week ahead. The program did not exist. Cold sweat beaded on his temples. This was a setup. Someone's malicious, elaborately staged play. He began to sift through names and faces in his mind, searching for an enemy or prankster capable of such an intricate and expensive hoax. But the list was empty. He had no enemies of that magnitude. And friends? None of them would spend an amount on a prank equivalent to a year's good earnings. Logic, his faithful tool, his shield, was cracking, fissure by fissure. And through these cracks seeped a primal, pre-rational terror. He shook the money out of the envelope onto the table. Stacks of banknotes lay there, a heavy dead weight. They were not props. He picked up a bill, held it to the light, peering at the watermarks, feeling the embossed print with his fingers. The money was authentic. as authentic as the needle that had pricked his skin, and the blood absorbed into the dry parchment. Every logical argument shattered against this paper reef. A play in which actors are paid with real gold ceases to be a play. It becomes a ritual. And then he understood. The realization came not as an epiphany, but as a slow submersion in icy water. The deal was real, not a metaphor, not an allegory, not a subject for drawing room debates. It was a fact of his new biography, as real as his name and birth date. And the last page of that biography had now been torn out. He had sold eternity. An eternity he didn't believe in, but whose absence he suddenly felt like an amputated limb, hurting more unbearably than living flesh. The emptiness within him had found a name. With a trembling hand, he dialed the number of an old university friend, the most scathing cynic he knew. He needed a voice of reason to mock him, call him a fool, and pull him back into the familiar world. Haltingly, stammering, Igor recounted what had happened. A long pause hung on the line, then a calm, slightly condescending laugh. Igor, listen to yourself. You've just overheated in the sun. Soul, devil, that's the vocabulary of old women gossiping by the entrance. Eat something, drink some cold water, and stop imagining nonsense. The short beeps sounded like a verdict. He was alone. He tried again. His wife returned from the store, and he met her in the hallway, trying to convey the full gravity of his discovery in his words. She listened, unpacking her bags, her face expressing weary annoyance. My God, Igor. Another one of your existential crises. Sold your soul. You'd be better off taking out the trash. Get busy, and these silly ideas will blow right out of your head. She walked into the kitchen, leaving him standing in the middle of the hallway. And at that moment, he finally understood his place. He was no longer part of their world. He was an outsider, marked by a sign invisible to them, but burned into his very essence. They lived in the cozy fortress of their beliefs, where the devil was just a fairy tale and the soul a poetic image. But he stood outside, beyond the wall, on the scorched earth of the concluded deal, and saw what they did not. A bottomless black eternity into which he was destined to fall. He collapsed to his knees in the middle of the room, and a hoarse, animalistic howl tore from his throat, not a scream, but an attempt to vomit out the icy nothingness that now lived within him. He pounded his fists on the parquet floor, shouting meaningless curses into the void, addressing the one whose existence he had laughed at just yesterday. He called for his buyer, demanded him, begged him to appear. It was the rebellion of a condemned man pounding on the wall of his cell, knowing that beyond it lay only more identical walls. "Show yourself," he cried, his voice breaking. "Give it back! I demand you!" And he appeared, not in a pillar of fire, not in sulphurous smoke. He was simply sitting in the old armchair by the window, a spot Igor hadn't looked at a second ago. A young man in a simple gray suit with smoothly combed hair and a face devoid of any expression save polite attention. He looked at Igor the way an entomologist looks at an insect twitching in a jar. Igor fell silent mid-word. The air in his lungs turned to glass. He slowly rose, leaning on trembling hands. The fear was so immense that it ceased to be an emotion and became a physical state. A cold in his bones, lead in his veins. "Annul," Igor whispered, the words sounding pitiful, like a whimper. "I want to annul the deal." The young man nodded almost imperceptibly, as if the request was expected and entirely commonplace. "An annulment procedure exists," he said, his voice flat and colorless, like a weather announcer. "But it doesn't depend on me, nor on you. The contract, your seal upon it, is with another person. His name is also Igor. He will contact you." The guest paused, allowing his words to sink into Igor's consciousness. "If he willingly returns the parchment to you, the deal will be considered void. You have until midnight tomorrow, not a minute more." Without waiting for a reply, the young man vanished. He didn't dissolve or fade away. He simply wasn't there anymore. The armchair was empty. Only a faint, barely perceptible scent of ozone lingered, like after a nearby lightning strike. For a moment, a frantic, irrational hope flared in Igor's chest. There was a way out. There was a chance. He just needed to find this other Igor, this doppelganger, this keeper of his soul, and convince him, beg him, pay him. In the silent apartment, the phone on the table rang sharply. Igor flinched as if struck. He walked over and picked up the receiver, feeling his fingers grow icy. "Hello? Igor?" A calm, unfamiliar male voice said from the other end. "My name is Igor too. I have what you're looking for." Hope seared his heart like a hot poker. Yes, I'll do anything. What do you want?" "Money? Everything I have." There was a silence on the line. Then the voice spoke, enunciating each word with surgical precision. "I don't need money. I need your son. Bring him to me tomorrow. My friends want to play with him. If we like him, I'll return your paper." Igor remained silent, unable to process what he had heard. The voice on the phone clarified, with the same indifferent calm. "You understand, don't you? What kind of games I'm talking about?" He understood. And at that moment, two abysses opened before him. One, cold, abstract, promised an eternity. The other, warm, living, screaming, awaited him in the nursery, where his 5-year-old son slept. The choice was not between salvation and damnation. The choice was between two kinds of hell, and one of them he had to create with his own hands. The receiver in his hand was dead, but the hum continued inside his skull. The night brought no struggle. Struggle is for those who have something to defend. For Igor, on one side of the scales lay his own, now absolutely real, eternity and icy nothingness, and on the other, the short, finite horror of his son. His mind, sharpened for decades by design problems, worked with cold, dispassionate efficiency. He didn't tear at his hair, he calculated. He weighed the infinite against the finite, and his own infinite torment outweighed it. By morning, only a shell of a father remained, while inside a flawless survival mechanism operated. Love proved too abstract a construct to withstand the pressure of absolute fear. He called his mother-in-law at her dacha. His voice was calm and businesslike, like someone discussing furniture purchases. He lied that it was his wife's birthday, that he was preparing a surprise, and needed to pick up their son to be part of the celebration. His mother-in-law was delighted by his sudden thoughtfulness, her voice on the phone chiming with tenderness. He listened to her, feeling nothing but a dull impatience, as if waiting for a prolonged dial tone to end. The boy, who ran to meet him at the gate, was happy. He hugged his father's legs, trustingly and tightly. Igor patted his head, and his own hand felt like an alien, complex tool attached to his shoulder. In the car, his son chattered incessantly about bugs and a piece of glass he'd found in the grass. Igor drove, staring intently at the road. He didn't hear the words. He saw only the final destination of the route, an old house in an industrial district whose address had been dictated to him over the phone. He was transporting his child as one transports ransom, as one leads a lamb to slaughter, but without ritual tremor, without doubt. He had already made the sacrifice. There, in the silence of the night apartment, when his logic severed the last thread connecting him to the human world. Now he was merely delivering the body. They stopped before a dilapidated, unnumbered door. Igor turned off the ignition. "We're here," he said. "You'll go inside now, and Daddy will be back soon." He took his son's hand. The small palm was hot and damp. He led him to the door and pressed the doorbell. His heart wasn't beating. Inside him was the silence of scorched earth. He waited for the appearance of accomplices, ugly and filthy executors of another's will. The door opened. Standing on the threshold was the same young man in the gray suit. His face expressed nothing but polite attention. He looked at Igor, then shifted his gaze to the child holding his father's hand. And at that moment the entire construct of deception collapsed, revealing its monstrous, simple truth. There was no other Igor. There were no friends waiting for his son. There was only a test of the depth of his fall. And he had passed it with sickening success. He had proven he was ready. "Go home," the young man said, his voice as level as before. Igor couldn't utter a word. Hope, pathetic and ugly, stirred within him. Was that all? Was this enough? "That's not all," the guest continued, as if reading his thoughts. "You have one last condition, the simplest one. You must go to your wife and tell her the truth. All of it. About the deal, about the money, about our conversation, and about why you brought your son here today. You must describe your choice to her in full detail, hiding nothing, seeking no excuses. If you do this, at midnight the parchment will turn to ash, wherever it may be. The deal will be annulled." He stepped back and closed the door. Igor remained standing on the street, holding the hand of his son, who was both saved and betrayed. He understood. He had not been forgiven. He had simply been handed a different sentence. Not eternal torment in an abstract hell, but a short, yet absolute hell on earth. He was not merely to confess his sin. He was to kill his wife's love with his own hands, word by word, destroy his home, burn to ashes the world he had done everything to preserve for himself. He was to become the executioner of his own life. Slowly, like an automaton, he turned and led his son back to the car. Ahead lay the final road, the road to the gallows he would have to build himself in his own living room. The key turned in the lock with a dry click, like a bone snapping. His wife stood in the hallway, her face taut with anxiety. She had been waiting for him for hours, frantically calling, and now her fear had given way to angry relief. But seeing his eyes, empty, calm, like the surface of a frozen lake, she fell silent. He walked into the living room without removing his shoes and remained standing in the middle of the room, staring into nothingness. His son slept in his bed, unaware of his second birth a few blocks away. "I have something to tell you," Igor said, his voice alien, flat, devoid of any warmth, as if a mechanism was reproducing human speech. And he told her. He didn't confess, didn't repent. He stated facts, as one would state the conditions of a problem. He spoke of the deal in the park, of the parchment and the blood, of the guest in the gray suit. He spoke of his fear, not as an emotion, but as an immutable law of the universe that had revealed itself to him. He described this fear as an endless icy draft, before which all earthly life, all its joys and sorrows were merely the flickering flame of a candle about to go out. He told her about the phone call and the condition they had imposed. He didn't ask for forgiveness when he said he took their son to that house. He simply stated his choice, his cold, calculated logic. It was simple arithmetic, he explained, looking through her. On one side of the scales, his finite suffering. On the other, mine, infinite. Infinity always outweighs. He paused as if giving her time to appreciate the flawless calculation. I would have given you too, and myself. I would have burned this entire world to ashes, just to fill that abyss. She listened, and her face slowly changed. Anxiety faded, giving way to bewilderment, and then, to horror, pure and absolute. She was not looking at her husband, not at the man with whom she shared a bed and raised a child. Something else stood before her, a being for whom she and her son had ceased to be real. They had become variables in an equation, abstract quantities that could be sacrificed. She understood that he had not been deceived or driven mad. He had simply been shown how the world truly worked, and he, with all his rationality, had accepted its rules. Without a word, she turned and went to the nursery. She moved quietly, like a thief, afraid to wake not only the child but also the monster in the living room. She carried her sleepy son out in her arms, wrapping a blanket around him, grabbed her bag and car keys from the hanger. Igor didn't stir. He simply watched his former life collapse, with the same detached attention one observes the demolition of an old building. At the door, she turned. In her eyes there was neither hatred nor tears, only cold, definitive alienation. "Your soul," she said quietly, her words falling into the silence like stones into a well. "You were afraid to lose it there later, but you lost it here, today, right now." The door slammed shut. He was left alone. The silence in the apartment became dense, palpable. He walked to the table and looked at the parchment scroll lying next to the stack of money. He waited. The clock on the wall ticked off the final minutes of his ordeal. Exactly at midnight, when the hand paused at the top, the parchment burst into flames. A silent white flame consumed it in a fraction of a second, leaving no smoke or smell of burning. Only a thin layer of black ash remained on the table, which immediately scattered with an invisible movement of air. The deal was annulled. He was free. He had saved his eternity from fire, but condemned his life to absolute cold. He hadn't sold his soul, he had traded it for emptiness.